Support for this podcast comes from Smart Recruiters. Smart Recruiters is your all-in-one platform for faster, smarter hiring, making recruiting easy and effortless. Smart Recruiters are making some big changes, revamping their user experience, adding AI features, and refreshing the UI. I know from experience that they truly are a company that really values the recruiter and the practitioner. They understand the intricacies of the recruiting business, and this has always been reflected in their functionality and customer support. So it's exciting to hear that they're making a bunch of updates. If you're ready to be part of the future of talent acquisition, head over to smartrecruiters.com and find out what they're up to. Trust me, your team and your future hires will thank you.
There's been more of scientific discovery, more of technical advancement and material progress in your lifetime and mine than in all the ages of history.
Hi there, welcome to episode 639 of Recruiting Future with me, Matt Alder. Job interviews have always been a source of anxiety for many people. The pressure of showcasing your achievements to a stranger in an unnaturally structured conversation is not easy. And for many neuro-diverse people, it's pretty much impossible. The use of asynchronous video interviewing has helped the situation in some ways, but doesn't provide the opportunity for real-time conversation and exploration, which is critical in the later stages of a recruiting process. So, could a methodology that was originally designed to combat communication delays in space travel offer a solution that bridges the gap between synchronous and asynchronous interviewing in a way that's inclusive for everyone? My guest this week is Rob Braun, director and co-founder of Braiding Communications. Rob worked with NASA to develop a unique way of helping astronauts have real-time conversations with people back on Earth on future missions to the Moon and to Mars. He's now using that same technology to make recruiting processes more inclusive and effective. So how does this all work? Just keep listening to find out more.
Hi Rob, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi Matt, thanks very much for having me on the podcast.
An absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Please could you introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Rob Braun. I am co-founder of a company called Braiding Communications. And what we do is a couple of things. One of them is where we started, which is very strange, which is that we started in the space sector. And now we also deliver inclusive communication. So that's me and the company in a very small nutshell. And I'm sure we'll go into more detail soon.
Well, absolutely. And I really want to talk about inclusive communications, particularly in the context of talent acquisition. But I don't think we can go any further before you give us a bit more of the backstory about space. So tell us the backstory. How did the company come to be?
Sure. So the company came about when myself and my co-founder, who sadly is no longer involved, sadly had to leave for health reasons. But we started by solving a problem for future space travel, which is when humans go back to the moon, as they should do in a few years, and potentially sometime in the future go further into space, perhaps even as far as Mars, maybe in 20, 25 years' time. Those astronauts will be so far from Earth that all their communication back to Earth will suffer from a time delay, because even though it's using radio waves, which travel at the speed of light, which is the fastest possible speed in the universe, the distances are so vast that there's going to be a time delay, which at the moon is about a second and a half. And when humans get to Mars, it's going to be measured in minutes. And if you can imagine trying to record a podcast with somebody where there was a time delay of a few seconds even, or even a few minutes between you and the guest, it's impossible to have a natural communication. And because that's caused by basic laws of physics, everybody in the space sector just assumed it could never be solved and that the space sector would need to find ways to kind of cope without a solution. We came along with a solution which kind of shocked a lot of people. Just to be clear, we did not break any laws of physics, so there's nothing like that going on. But what we realized was that the way human beings communicate is actually quite adaptable and plastic. And what we did was we invented a methodology of communication that disguises latency. So if you were on Mars and I'm here on Earth, we could be communicating in a way that would feel to both of us pretty much like a natural synchronous dialogue, even though there's an underlying delay. And so we came up with that idea, as I said, a way of disguising, not removing latency, managed to blag our way into a NASA conference going back before lockdown, and showed this to some of the people who'd done some research in this area, and they were very excited. So actually, we're really proud of the fact that as a small British company, our first income actually came originally from NASA to study this idea and see if it worked. And the short answer is it did. So that's now there as a published academic paper. So that's where we started.
Awesome. Tell us about how this works. So I know that people will be fascinated that you are somehow breaking the laws of physics without breaking the laws of physics. So just tell us a little bit about how it works.
Yeah, sure. And it's kind of super simple, but not obvious. And actually, at some points when I have this conversation with people kind of go, oh, is that it? I was expecting something a little bit more exciting with kind of bells and whistles and flashy lights on it. It's actually really simple, as I said, and sometimes the best ideas are the simplest. So I'll try and describe it. It's very visual as well, so it's a little bit difficult on a podcast. But essentially, if you can imagine, if you were on Mars and I'm on Earth and we're communicating and there's a time delay of maybe 5 minutes, you can't just pick up the phone to me and call me because it will take 5 minutes for my phone to ring. So everything is kind of pre-scheduled. So we probably agree the day before that we're going to have a communication session. And what we do is we agree the topics. So let's say, for the sake of argument and simplicity, there are 6 topics we want to discuss. When the session starts, you're on Mars, I'm on Earth. Both of us log on to our computers to communicate. Braiding is entirely written. There's no audio and no video. What you see on your screen is kind of a chat window. And what I see on my screen is another chat window, which is a different subject. And those 2 chat windows are 2 of, let's say, 6 chat windows arranged on a carousel that rotates between us kind of one step at a time. You're typing in one, I'm typing in another on the other side of the carousel. After maybe 2 minutes, the carousel rotates one step. The content you type begins its journey to me. The content I type begins its journey to you. And you then have a fresh braid, as we call it, to type on. And so do I. And the same thing happens a couple of times. And then after that carousel that we have between us has rotated half a rotation, you get the first message from me that I typed about 7 or 8 minutes ago, and it's taken 5 minutes to travel across the void to you. At the same instant, I get the first message from you. And from that moment onwards, as the carousel rotates, each of us gets a fresh message from the other person. Even though that other person wrote it ages ago, 5, 6, 7 minutes, whatever it is, it doesn't actually matter. To each of us, it feels like a message just received from the other person. So that's why to us as human beings, it feels like a natural synchronous dialogue. So I said, super simple, very visual. So maybe the listeners can go and see on our website and see some visuals of this. But it works amazingly well, and it's now been studied in academic studies and shown to work.
So this was before the pandemic. The pandemic obviously comes along and changes the way that people work. So we have far more remote work. We have teams working remotely, people getting very burnt out by constantly being on video, and, companies looking for new ways of communicating and communicating more effectively. How did what you do evolve based on that?
You're absolutely right. All those things were happening. And actually what happened to allow us to kind of take what we'd invented for space and adapt it to here on Earth was that when we were building it, as we were testing it, and this is myself and my co-founder, began to realize that this strange thing we invented for space was allowing the two of us to communicate better together, or perhaps might be better to say communicate differently. So like everyone else, we use emails, we use phone calls, we use Zoom and Meet and Teams and other things. And all of those, each of them had, if you like, different weaknesses in some senses. And they were all kind of very similar in other ways. All meeting technologies are broadly the same in that they allow people to communicate together and talk together. What we realized was this braiding thing was allowing us to communicate in a synchronous manner, but without some of the weaknesses that were impacting on some of our meetings. So one of the biggest problems, and this is a challenge for you here, Matt, is one of my biggest weaknesses is I talk too much. And I do have a habit in meetings of sometimes talking too much and dominating the meeting. I try hard not to. I'm very aware of that. But obviously for me, that means I have to think hard not to interrupt, which means I'm not thinking so much about the content of the meeting. What we realized was by taking our braided approach and adapting it into a meeting on Earth, we were able to create an environment where each of us could contribute without me interrupting too much. So that was one of the benefits. There's a whole bunch of others, because actually what it turns out is that all individuals have different communication preferences, different environments in which they thrive. And when you look into some of the research for this, a traditional meeting, whether that's face-to-face or video, is really only an ideal environment for people who are neurotypical, confident, and extrovert. Anyone who doesn't really fit that mold struggles in a face-to-face meeting, and that can apply to different people at different times. So someone might be really confident in one meeting, but go into a different meeting where maybe there's a different power dynamic or a different age profile or whatever it might be, and that person suddenly feels unable to contribute. So traditional meetings don't tend to adapt to all environments. So we all need other tools in the toolbox, and it turns out that braiding can be a new tool in the toolbox, particularly for inclusive and effective meetings.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I want to dive into the inclusive part of this in a second. But I think the interesting thing from that kind of meeting perspective is, for years, I've been interviewing people who run remote first companies kind of before the pandemic. And asynchronous communication is such a big part of people who work like that, particularly if they're working across time zones and things like that. But actually, the kind of the technology around asynchronous communication isn't particularly sophisticated. And it's really interesting to see something that bridges the gap between very, very asynchronous communication where people are getting replies hours later and ineffective real-time video meetings. So I think it's a gap that is definitely there to be filled.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Matt. And I think actually the word synchronous is a key point there. So some of the studies around the way people communicate is that for effective, really genuinely effective communication, you need to have what's called co-presence. You need to feel co-present with other individuals. That isn't always the same as co-located. Co-presence is a concept that's enabled by synchrony, but synchrony doesn't necessarily mean at the same time. It means with a shared rhythm and a shared focus of attention in that psychological communication sense. And you can have people sat around a table or sat around a virtual video conference who don't feel that sense of connection. They don't feel that sense of co-presence. And that's one of the things that we've realized that braiding does, is it brings that sense of co-presence to more people in environments who otherwise would struggle to feel that sense of co-presence and therefore struggle to communicate. And that's why it kind of covers a gap in existing technologies where they're not actually able to provide that for everybody.
Talk us through the applications of this talent acquisition.
So yeah, in talent acquisition, there's one very, very simple application. So and actually to me, the way I think about it is talent acquisition and also talent retention, which is just as important. So braiding as a technology can create meetings that are inclusive and effective, incredibly effective. In fact, on average, about 8 times more efficient than the same meeting in a traditional manner. So if you've got a team that you want to retain and then build, you need to create environments in which they can all communicate, and that's where braided meetings exist. But then we have a sister product, which we call braided interviews, because we're really imaginative with our names, which is very much focused on the talent acquisition part of this. So there's been a lot of studies and work recently about creating inclusive processes for recruitment, and a lot of really good work, and some things which with hindsight are kind of obvious, but none of us really thought of them before. So things like making sure your language is really unambiguous, making sure you're advertising roles and searching for talent in places where the talent might be, rather than, for want of a better word, where you've always looked before, and adapting processes to perhaps be more skills-based, etc. But in most cases, there's still a desire for an interview to be part of the process. So how do you interview people who perhaps might struggle with face-to-face communication, or that's a key part of an interview process. Now, about a year or so ago, the kind of gold standard for inclusive interviewing was to say two things. First of all, it's really important to send the questions out in advance, and actually that tends to be regarded as good practice for all interviews now. So you send the questions out in advance so people can at least prepare and not be completely caught off guard by a kind of left field question. But then for inclusive interviews, it was, well, the only thing you can then do is get email answers back and then follow up with another email for a follow-up question. And that is a very asynchronous process, and it puts the diverse candidate at a disadvantage, because by the time you've gone through a process over 3 or 4 days of questions and follow-ups, by the time you've done that, the neurotypical candidate's probably already been offered and accepted the job. So instead of that, you go to try a braided interview, which is using this braided methodology to allow the candidates to actually be interviewed in a synchronous real-time environment with the interviewer, but without any of the challenges that would make them struggle in a face-to-face interview. So that's what's out there at the moment, being used not by many people. This is still a very early stage business, and this is a very early stage product, but this seems to be doing a great job of creating a fairer playing field where everybody can shine. So if someone chooses a braided interview, that gives them an equal chance to shine compared to someone else who might choose video or face-to-face.
I think that's really interesting, because when it comes to neurodiversity in the recruiting process, it's talked about a lot. A lot of the adjustments that are made to the interviewing process, they're not very big adjustments. They're not changing the process. They're just kind of tweaking things slightly to swing it a little bit more in the favor of the neurodiverse candidate, but not fundamentally doing anything different. And it's interesting to hear about this, because it is a very different way of doing things, but it's a way of doing things that could apply to all candidates, couldn't it?
Absolutely, it could. And actually, there's another point there about the interviewer themselves as well. But to apply to candidates, I mean, when we're talking to companies who are looking at braided interviews, we're careful to say it's the company's choice, obviously, but we would never recommend that they mandate braided interviews for all candidates, because for some candidates, it's not the perfect environment, but for some it is. So if you have a choice, and one of the most important things there is to bring consistency. So if you're interviewing 2 people, you should be saying, these are the 5 questions I'm going to ask you, both you, whoever the candidates are. But if a candidate A chooses a face-to-face interview and candidate B chooses a braided interview, they're going to get the same 5 questions. They're going to get the same chance to shine in their answers on those questions, but with a very different methodology that's much more inclusive to many people. As I said, the same thing I think will apply over time to interviewers as well. I mean, I've worked in a number of big companies across my career, and when I look back now, and this wasn't something that was kind of discussed at the time, but there were always some managers who really struggled with interviewing, and many of them kind of didn't want to and would delegate it to other managers who then might not be the best qualified to assess the candidates for the roles. And maybe those managers were neurodiverse in one way or another, and probably didn't even know it back in the 90s, early 2000s. But if they had alternative methods with which they could interview candidates, it may well have helped them find better candidates for their vacancies. So it sits on both sides of it, which I personally think is really interesting.
So as a final question for you, what do you hope the future looks like in terms of recruiting and business communication in general?
Well, it's a big question. Obviously, I really hope it's something that becomes more and more inclusive over time. Certainly, in my career, I've seen some significant strides towards inclusivity and the embracing of diversity in all its aspects, and that's just fantastic. One of my favourite phrases in that is taking an old phrase and slightly changing it. The old phrase of "great minds think alike." Absolute rubbish, in my opinion. Great minds do not think alike. If you have a diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of experience, you're much more likely to get better outcomes, better solutions to problems, and more solutions to problems. So I personally am very excited by the opportunity and to embrace and include more inclusivity over time, both in the talent acquisition process and in the general business process as well.
Rob, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks very much, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
My thanks to Rob. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or via your podcasting app of choice. You can search all the past episodes at recruitingfuture.com. On that site, you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Recruiting Future Feast, and get the inside track on everything that's coming up on the show. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be back next time, and I hope you'll join me.